the story that we read and that Pastor Natalie just walks through also, it's helpful to think of the background. I'm getting a note, so you cannot hear sound on Zoom. Hang with us. Okay, you can hear us. Okay, good. Sorry, radio folks. Okay, so thinking about just the background, the context of this story that Pastor Natalie just spoke about, I think it's helpful. So the chapter before this, Moses was at the top of a mountain meeting with God. And before that, the people had been traveling through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And if you keep backing up, they were slaves in Egypt. And so the Israelites are slaves in Egypt, and then God delivers them with a bunch of plagues. And I wonder if that maybe wasn't the equivalent of what 2020 is for us, for them back then. But anyway, so then they go on this journey. God parts the Red Sea, and they walk on dry land. You'll remember some of these stories. And then Pharaoh's army starts to make it on dry land, and the sea closes in on them. And then the people continue through the wilderness, and they're following God in this pillar of cloud in the daytime and a pillar of fire at nighttime. Some of these stories might be familiar to you if you grew up in church, perhaps. God provides manna to feed the people in the wilderness, and then quail when they get tired of manna. And then even water is just coming out of rocks at Moses' command. And then we get to that chapter before this one, where Moses climbs up the mountain to meet with God. And somewhere in there, the people have lost patience or hope or trust in this God that they'd seen in all these extraordinary moments, and now left with only ordinary moments there at the bottom of the mountain. They don't know how to find or see God around them. So in that chapter before this one, that I actually started to read unintentionally earlier, it says that they take their gold and they melt it and they shape it into an image of their own making. And it's this calf, this golden calf that you might remember as well. Inanimate, but it was tangible. They craft something they think to be extraordinary. And they dance and they sing and they worship this idol that maybe their neighboring enemies could see and be afraid of or convert into following. And all of this is while Moses is at the top of the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments. And he comes down and the people are ashamed and they melt the golden calf, which is noteworthy. They didn't keep it up as a monument to remember, as a history lesson. It was something that they should never celebrate again, so it's destroyed. And then we get to today's chapter. And you can hear in Moses' voice his need for God's presence to continue with them on their journey into the promised land. He says, unless you go with us. He doesn't want a repeat of the same mistake the people had just fallen into. And as I think about us as First Baptist, but just humanity in general right now, our universal angst about life and death is on full display in nearly every argument around masks or social distancing, around whether businesses or people are more important, around whether accountability of those with power across the world is important. In racial justice, in the status quo, in elections, in leaders, in sermons, we are keenly aware of our vulnerability, whether we own up to it or pretend it isn't the case for us. And that is a lot of stress and adrenaline and subsequent crashes of all that adrenaline that leads to exhaustion and burnout and short tempers and frayed relationships and increased pressure to perform. And the cycle repeats every day, each time you go out of your home and into the wild, where a microscopic agent is as invisible as God seems to be these days. We're both grounded at home and also dislocated from our way of life. And that seems similar to the Israelites in the story of Exodus. The people of God were grounded to the same path and wilderness and journey, days and weeks and years of the same terrain and food and neighbors and weather. And they were at the same time a dislocated people. And they had come to find God in the extraordinary examples I mentioned before of the Red Sea or the 10 plagues or the pillar of fire or pillar of cloud. But what were the ordinary moments that they missed or that weren't recorded? For us, some of the most extraordinary and worshipful moments that you've had in your lives have been inside the walls of this building right behind you. Or maybe other buildings similar to it, next to people like those here in the parking lot or joining you over Zoom or Facebook Live. You've come to know God in these ways over all these years in this space. And now, for these past 7 months, you've been grounded at home and dislocated from so much of your way of life, including your church home. Now, I don't want to suggest that you've begun collecting your necklaces and rings in order to fashion a golden calf, or that you have melted down your Tom Brady bust in order to make a new mold of Cam Newton. But I wonder, together with you, what it is that we might be substituting or searching for in this period where it seems like God is so far away on top of some distant mountain during this pandemic. What has lured away your focus, your energy, your patience, your hope, your trust that God is with you? On the flip side of that same coin, a second question I ask you this morning: what are the ordinary moments in your day-to-day life, as disorienting as it has been, where you might be able to see God if only you have the eyes to see God? Today's story says that God covered Moses' face with God's hand in order to protect his life. And so Moses only saw the back of God after God passed by. It reminds me sort of that solar eclipse a few years ago where we had to make those weird boxes to look through, or we had special glasses that most of us wore. You could only look at it for a moment. So you had to have these other tools to protect your eyes. The rest of the time, though, when there's not a solar eclipse, the sun is still right there, behind clouds or blue skies like today, behind trees, or glaring off of the snow. Every day the sun is there, and we don't notice it all that often until it's an inconvenience, I suppose. So where is God in your new normal, your new routine, your new everyday of these past 7 months? It might seem like God is absent these days, or that you aren't able to see or worship or experience God outside of this building, or apart from particular music. But for a people who are dislocated and disoriented, those are more like the extraordinary moments when God's presence was apparent. That pillar of cloud or pillar of fire or Red Sea or manna from heaven. They were the precedents that this time without precedents lacks. So in a time that craves any sign or witness or hope of God's presence and provision, let's turn to the ordinary moments that offer the evidence that God has passed by, even if all we can see is God's back. So who are the people revealing glimpses of God's work in their lives? What are the projects, the movements, the good deeds that are unveiling evidence of God's presence with and around and within us? If I had told you that God had just passed by, what would you look for?